Millionaire's Fiancée beat his blind mother with a broomstick, unaware he was watching. 1 minute later, she was begging him for forgiveness, but it was too late. The broom came down again. Margaret Jensen's blind eyes couldn't see the hatred in her son's fiancée's face, but she could feel the wood splitting her lip, could taste her own blood as Monica screamed about 2 years of disrespect. What Margaret didn't know was that Stephen had just pulled into the driveway. What Monica didn't know was that her lies were about to unravel in the most brutal way possible. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble foyer of the Jensen estate as Stephen adjusted his Italian silk tie one last time. His reflection in the hallway mirror showed a man who had everything: sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, and the kind of confidence that came from turning a small tech startup into a billion-dollar empire before his 35th birthday. But it was the warmth in his smile as he looked toward the staircase that revealed his true treasure. "Monica," he called out, his voice echoing through the grand hallway adorned with crystal chandeliers and original paintings worth more than most people's homes. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" The sound of heels clicking against marble announced her arrival before she appeared. Monica Brown descended the staircase like something out of a fairy tale, her dark skin glowing against the emerald evening gown that hugged her curves perfectly. At 26, she possessed a beauty that could stop traffic, but it was her infectious laugh and quick wit that had captured Stephen's heart 2 years ago at a charity gala. "You know I'm always ready before you," she teased, adjusting the diamond necklace he'd given her for their anniversary, a piece worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. "The question is, are you ready to charm those investors into throwing even more money at your latest project?" Stephen crossed the space between them in 3 strides, pulling her close and breathing in the intoxicating scent of her perfume. "With you by my side, I could convince them to fund a mission to Mars." Their laughter filled the space, but it was interrupted by the soft sound of a cane tapping against the floor. Both turned toward the sound as Margaret Jensen made her way carefully down the hallway. Her unseeing eyes focused straight ahead, but her motherly instincts guiding her toward her son's voice. At 72, Margaret Jensen carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had weathered life's storms and emerged stronger. The cataracts that had stolen her sight 5 years ago hadn't dimmed her spirit or her fierce love for her only child. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and despite her blindness, she moved through her son's home with the grace of someone who refused to be defined by her limitations. "Stephen, darling," she said, reaching out until her fingers found his arm. "Are you sure you have to leave tonight? You just got back from Tokyo last week." Stephen's expression softened as he covered his mother's hand with his own. "It's only for a week, Mom. The Singapore deal requires my personal attention, and you know how important this expansion is for the company." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, an expression Monica had learned to recognize over the past 2 years. It was the same look the older woman got whenever Stephen mentioned traveling, working late, or any activity that took him away from home. Monica watched the interaction with carefully controlled features, but those who knew her well might have noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. "Of course, dear," Margaret said, her voice carrying the practiced cheerfulness of a mother who had learned long ago not to voice every concern. "I just worry about you working too hard. You're already so successful. Surely you could send someone else to handle these negotiations." "Mom," Stephen's voice held gentle reproach, "you know I don't trust anyone else with deals this important. Besides, you'll have Monica here to keep you company. You two have been getting along so well lately." If Margaret noticed Monica's almost imperceptible flinch at those words, she didn't show it. Instead, she turned in Monica's direction with a smile that didn't quite reach her sightless eyes. "Of course." Monica is always such attentive company. The words hung in the air with a weight that Stephen, already mentally focused on his upcoming trip, failed to notice. But Monica heard every nuance, every carefully chosen syllable that seemed to carry meanings within meanings. "I should check on dinner," Monica said suddenly, her voice bright with forced cheerfulness. "Mrs. Henderson left everything prepared, but you know how you like your roast beef, Stephen." As Monica's heels clicked rapidly toward the kitchen, Margaret's head tilted slightly, the way it always did when she was listening intently to something others might miss. "She seems tense tonight," Margaret observed quietly. Stephen was checking his phone for flight updates, barely registering his mother's words. "Wedding planning stress, probably. You know how women get about these things. She's been working with that planner downtown. Wants everything to be perfect for the spring ceremony." Margaret said nothing, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her cane. The evening passed in a blur of last-minute preparations and tender goodbyes. Stephen's driver loaded his luggage into the Bentley, while Monica clung to him on the front steps, her body language speaking of a woman desperately in love. "I'm going to miss you so much," she whispered against his chest, and Stephen could have sworn he heard tears in her voice. "It's only 7 days," he murmured, tilting her chin up to meet his gaze. "And when I get back, we'll finalize the wedding venue. I want to marry you as soon as possible, Monica. I love you more than I ever thought possible." The kiss they shared was passionate enough to make the driver politely look away, and when Stephen finally pulled back, Monica's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you too," she whispered. "More than you'll ever know." From the doorway, Margaret listened to their exchange with the acute hearing that blindness had sharpened. Something in Monica's tone made her uneasy, though she couldn't quite identify what it was. Perhaps it was the way the younger woman's voice seemed to carry undertones of desperation rather than simple longing. As the Bentley disappeared into the night, Monica stood on the steps until the taillights vanished completely. Only then did she turn back toward the house, where Margaret waited in the doorway. "Well," Monica said, her voice carefully neutral, "I suppose it's just us girls for the week." Margaret nodded, her fingers finding the familiar comfort of her cane's handle. "Yes, just us." Neither woman spoke of the tension that seemed to crackle between them like static electricity before a storm. Neither acknowledged the way their polite smiles seemed painted on, or how their carefully chosen words felt like verbal chess moves in a game neither was willing to name. But as they moved back into the house, Monica with purposeful strides and Margaret with careful, measured steps, the Jensen mansion seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls sensed that the careful balance maintained for 2 years was about to shift dramatically. In his first-class seat somewhere over the Pacific, Stephen Jensen was already deep in preparation for his Singapore meetings, completely unaware that he had just left the 2 most important women in his life alone together in a house that was about to become the stage for a confrontation that would change everything forever. What do you think drives someone to hide their true feelings until they explode? Have you ever witnessed a situation where misunderstandings led to devastating consequences? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to read about your experience. The first day passed like a carefully choreographed dance of politeness. Monica brought Margaret her morning tea on the antique silver tray, helped her navigate to her favorite reading chair by the window, and even read aloud from the romance novel Margaret had been enjoying. To any observer, they would have appeared to be 2 women growing closer in the absence of the man they both loved. But beneath the surface, something else entirely was brewing. "Monica, dear," Margaret said on the second morning as they sat in the sunroom, her voice carrying that particular tone that had begun to grate on Monica's nerves. "Have you given any thought to the prenuptial agreement Stephen mentioned?" Monica's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. "Prenuptial agreement? Oh my!" Margaret's hand fluttered to her chest in what appeared to be genuine surprise. "He hasn't discussed it with you yet? I just assumed. Well, with the family wealth and the business interests." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch. Monica set down her cup with deliberate care, the fine china making the softest clink against the saucer. "No," Monica said slowly. "Stephen hasn't mentioned anything about a prenuptial agreement." Margaret's unseeing eyes seemed to look right through her. "I'm sure it's nothing personal, dear. It's just that when someone has built what Stephen has built." She trailed off with a delicate shrug. "Well, you understand. These things are just standard practice in families like ours." Families like ours. The phrase hit Monica like a slap. Not our family, families like ours. The distinction was clear, and Margaret's tone suggested that Monica was not, and perhaps never would be, part of that exclusive circle. "Of course," Monica replied, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "I completely understand." But she didn't understand. She understood nothing about why the woman, whose son claimed to love her unconditionally, seemed determined to plant seeds of doubt and insecurity. She understood nothing about why every conversation with Margaret felt like a minefield, where one wrong step could expose her as the outsider she apparently was. By the third day, the pretense was wearing thin. Monica found Margaret in Stephen's study, her fingers moving carefully across the surface of his mahogany desk. The older woman's touch was reverent, almost possessive, as she traced the edges of picture frames and the leather binding of his business journals. "Looking for something?" Monica asked from the doorway, making no effort to hide the edge in her voice. Margaret didn't startle or show embarrassment at being caught. Instead, she continued her tactile exploration of her son's private space. "I was just remembering. This desk belonged to my husband, Stephen's father. Robert spent countless hours here, building the foundation that Stephen expanded into his empire." Monica stepped into the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "That's a beautiful memory." "It is." Margaret's fingers found a small silver frame, a photo of Stephen and Monica from their first vacation together. She held it carefully, as if she could see the image through her fingertips. "You know, Monica, I've always wondered what you see in Stephen." The question was so unexpected, so direct, that Monica actually took a step back. "I'm sorry. It's a simple question." Margaret set the frame down with infinite care. "What is it about my son that captured your heart? His kindness? His humor? His intelligence?" Monica felt heat rising in her cheeks. "All of those things. Stephen is an incredible man." Margaret moved to another section of the desk, her hands finding a crystal paperweight that Stephen had inherited from his grandfather. "And his wealth? His success? The lifestyle he can provide? Surely those factors don't hurt." The accusation was wrapped in such gentle tones that for a moment Monica wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. When the words fully registered, the fury that had been simmering for 3 days finally began to boil over. "Are you suggesting that I'm with Stephen for his money?" Margaret turned toward Monica's voice, her expression perfectly composed. "I'm not suggesting anything, dear. I'm simply trying to understand what a young woman like you, beautiful, vibrant, with presumably many options, sees in a man who works 18-hour days and travels constantly for business." "A man like Stephen, you mean?" "A man who is completely devoted to his mother," Margaret corrected softly. "A man who has never failed to put family first, even when it meant sacrificing his own happiness." The words hit like physical blows. Monica could hear the subtext clearly now. "You are not family. You never will be family. And if it comes down to choosing between you and me, we both know who he'll choose." "I think," Monica said with dangerous calm, "that Stephen is perfectly capable of making his own decisions about what makes him happy." "Of course he is." Margaret's smile was serene, almost pitying. "I just hope that when he does make those decisions, he remembers everything that truly matters to him." That night, Monica lay in Stephen's bed. Their bed, she reminded herself fiercely, staring at the ceiling and replaying every interaction with Margaret over the past 2 years. How had she been so blind? How had she missed the careful way Margaret undermined her? The subtle suggestions that she wasn't good enough, wasn't the right choice for Stephen. She thought about the prenuptial agreement comment. Had Stephen really discussed that with his mother before mentioning it to her? The thought made her stomach churn with a combination of rage and humiliation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Stephen. Missing you like crazy. Singapore meeting's going better than expected. Might be able to come home a day early. Can't wait to hold you again. She stared at the message until the words blurred. A day early. That would be tomorrow instead of the weekend. The thought should have filled her with joy, but instead, it only intensified the storm raging inside her chest. The fourth day brought the confrontation Monica hadn't even realized she'd been planning. She found Margaret in the garden room, sitting in her usual chair with her tea and her audiobook. The older woman looked so peaceful, so content in her carefully ordered world where she remained the most important woman in her son's life. "Margaret," Monica said, not bothering with the usual pleasantries, "we need to talk." Something in Monica's tone must have alerted Margaret to the shift in dynamics, because she reached for the remote to pause her audiobook and turned toward Monica's voice with new attentiveness. "Of course, dear. What's on your mind?" Monica closed the distance between them, choosing to remain standing while Margaret sat. A deliberate power play that she hoped the older woman would feel even if she couldn't see it. "I want to know why you hate me." Margaret's expression didn't change, but Monica caught the almost imperceptible tightening of her fingers around her teacup. "Hate you? Monica, whatever gave you that idea?" "Don't." Monica's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Don't you dare pretend anymore. I've spent 2 years trying to win your approval, trying to understand why nothing I do is ever good enough for you. But I finally figured it out." "And what exactly have you figured out?" "That you don't hate me because of anything I've done or haven't done. You hate me because I exist. Because Stephen loves me. Because for the first time in his life, someone else might come first." Margaret set down her teacup with a sharp clink. "That's quite an accusation. Is it wrong?" Monica's voice was rising now, months of suppressed frustration finally finding its voice. "Tell me, Margaret, when was the last time Stephen made a major decision without consulting you first? When was the last time he planned a vacation or bought a house or even chose a restaurant without making sure it met with your approval? Stephen is a loving son. Stephen is a grown man who's been trained since childhood to believe that your happiness is more important than his own." Monica was pacing now, her hands gesturing wildly. "And you've encouraged that, haven't you? You've made yourself so indispensable, so fragile, that he feels guilty for wanting anything that doesn't revolve around you." Margaret stood slowly, her cane finding the floor with deliberate precision. "I think you're upset and saying things you don't mean. I mean every word." Monica stepped closer, close enough that Margaret would be able to feel her presence even without sight. "You've been sabotaging our relationship from day one. The little comments, the passive-aggressive suggestions, the way you make me feel like an intruder in what's supposed to be my own home. This is Stephen's home. This is going to be our home after we're married. Our home, our life, our future. And you can't stand that, can you?" Margaret's composure was beginning to crack, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "I want what's best for my son." "You want to keep your son?" Monica's voice was deadly quiet now. "You want to make sure no one ever loves him as much as you do, because if they did, you might not be the center of his universe anymore. That's enough." Margaret's cane struck the floor with sharp emphasis. "I've listened to enough of this childish tantrum. Stephen chose you, Monica. I've accepted that. But I will not stand here and be attacked in my own son's home." "Accepted it?" Monica laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You've spent 2 years trying to prove that I'm not good enough for him. The prenuptial agreement comment was just the latest attempt to make me question his commitment." Margaret's face went very still. "I mentioned the prenuptial agreement because it's a reasonable precaution. You mentioned it because you wanted to plant doubt in my mind. You wanted me to wonder if Stephen sees me as a potential gold digger instead of the woman he wants to spend his life with. If the suggestion bothered you so much, perhaps you should examine why. The words hit Monica like a match to gasoline. Something inside her snapped with an almost audible crack, and suddenly she was moving toward the kitchen, her vision tunneled with rage. Margaret followed the sound of Monica's retreating footsteps, her cane tapping against the floor as she tried to navigate the familiar path from the garden room to the kitchen. "Monica? Monica, where are you going?" Monica's hands were shaking as she reached for the broom closet, her fingers closing around the handle of Mrs. Henderson's old cleaning broom. The weight of it felt solid in her hands, substantial. "Real. Monica?" Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway, her head tilted in that listening pose that Monica had once found endearing, but now made her want to scream. "I'm right here, Margaret." Monica's voice was calm now, deadly calm. "I'm right here in the kitchen, in Stephen's house, in the life you've been trying to steal back from me for 2 years. Margaret took a careful step into the kitchen, her free hand extended slightly as she tried to orient herself in the space. "I think you need to sit down, dear. You're clearly upset." "Upset?" Monica raised the broom, though Margaret couldn't see the threatening gesture. "Oh, Margaret, I'm so much more than upset." It was Margaret's next words that pushed Monica over the edge she'd been teetering on for days. "Perhaps," Margaret said with that same maddening composure, "you should call Stephen and tell him you're not feeling well. I'm sure he could arrange for you to stay somewhere else until you've had time to calm down and think clearly about what you really want." What you really want. As if Monica's desire to marry Stephen, to build a life with him, was some kind of temporary madness that would pass if she just took time to think about it rationally. The first blow caught Margaret completely off guard. The broom handle struck her shoulder, sending her stumbling backward with a cry of shock and pain. Her cane clattered to the floor as she reached out desperately for something to steady herself against. "Monica." Margaret's voice was sharp with disbelief. "What are you?" The second blow cut off her words, catching her across the ribs and driving the air from her lungs. Margaret's hands went up instinctively to protect herself, but her blindness made her movements clumsy and ineffective. 2 years. Monica screamed, raising the broom again. 2 years of your passive-aggressive bullshit. 2 years of you making me feel like I don't belong. The third blow sent Margaret crashing into the kitchen island, her hip connecting with the marble edge hard enough to make her gasp in pain. "Please," Margaret whispered, her voice small and frightened in a way Monica had never heard before. "Please, Monica, stop. I don't understand." "You don't understand?" Monica's laughter was wild, unhinged. "You understand perfectly. You've been trying to drive me away since the day we met, and now you want to play the victim." Margaret was on the floor now, her hands raised protectively over her head as she tried to shield herself from the blows that kept coming. Her carefully styled silver hair was disheveled, and there was blood on her lip where she'd bitten it when she fell. I only wanted." Margaret's words came in gasps between the strikes. "I only wanted what was best for Stephen." "Liar." The broom came down again, catching Margaret's raised forearm. "You wanted to keep him all to yourself. You wanted to make sure no one else could ever be more important to him than his precious mother." It was then, as Monica raised the broom for what might have been the killing blow, that she heard the sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. The soft click of a key turning in the front door lock. Monica's hands went still, the broom suspended above Margaret's cowering form. Her ears strained for any sound that might tell her she'd been mistaken, that it was just the house settling or the wind rattling the windows. But then came the sound she'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure for the past 4 days. Stephen's voice, calling out as he always did when he came home. "Monica? Mom. I'm back early. The Singapore deal closed faster than expected. Have you ever witnessed someone completely lose control of their emotions? What do you think drives a person to cross lines they never thought they would cross? I'm curious about your thoughts on what happens when jealousy and insecurity reach their breaking point. Share your thoughts below. Time seemed to fracture into crystalline moments, each one sharp enough to cut. Monica's breath caught in her throat as Stephen's footsteps echoed through the marble foyer, getting closer with each passing second. The broom felt impossibly heavy in her hands, and Margaret lay crumpled on the kitchen floor, her silver hair matted with sweat and streaked with traces of blood from where she'd bitten her lip during the fall. "Just a minute," Monica called out, her voice cracking despite her desperate attempt to sound normal. We're in the kitchen." She dropped the broom as if it had burned her, the wooden handle clattering against the tile floor with a sound that seemed to echo like thunder. Margaret flinched at the noise, her body curling in on itself protectively. "Oh God," Monica whispered, the reality of what she'd done hitting her like a physical blow. "Oh God, what have I done?" Margaret was trying to push herself up on shaking arms, her face pale with pain and shock. Blood had pooled slightly where her lip had split, and there were angry red marks on her forearms where the broom had struck her. Her unseeing eyes were wide with fear and confusion. "Monica," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why? Why would you?" The sound of Stephen's approaching footsteps sent panic shooting through Monica's veins like ice water. Her mind raced frantically, searching for some explanation, some way to make this look like anything other than what it was. "You fell," Monica said suddenly, dropping to her knees beside Margaret with performance-worthy concern. "You fell down and hit your head. That's what happened, isn't it?" Margaret's sightless gaze turned toward Monica's voice, and for a moment, the kitchen was silent except for the older woman's labored breathing and the distant sound of Stephen moving through the house. Margaret began, but Monica's hand closed around her wrist with bruising force. "You fell," Monica repeated, her voice low and urgent. "You were trying to reach something in the high cabinet, and you lost your balance. I wasn't even in the room when it happened." Margaret's face went very still as she absorbed not just Monica's words, but the threat implicit in them. Here was Stephen's fiancée, the woman he planned to marry, asking her to lie about an assault that had left her bloodied and bruised on her own kitchen floor. "Monica?" Stephen's voice was closer now, probably in the dining room. "Everything okay? You sound fine," Monica called back, releasing Margaret's wrist and standing quickly. She smoothed her hair and straightened her clothes, trying to erase any evidence of the violence that had just erupted. "Your mom had a little accident, but she's okay." The sound of Stephen's dress shoes against hardwood gave way to the softer whisper of his soles against kitchen tile. And then he was there, standing in the doorway with his travel bag still slung over his shoulder, and his face bright with the joy of an early homecoming. That joy died the instant he saw his mother on the floor. "Mom!" Stephen dropped his bag and crossed the kitchen in 2 long strides, falling to his knees beside Margaret with the kind of desperate urgency that spoke of a man who had already lost one parent and couldn't bear to lose another. "What happened? Are you hurt?" His hands moved over her with practiced care, checking for injuries with the thoroughness of someone who had been helping his blind mother navigate the world for years. The split lip didn't escape his notice, nor did the red marks on her arms that were already beginning to darken into bruises. "I'm all right, darling," Margaret said softly, but her voice shook with more than just pain. "Just a silly accident." Stephen's eyes swept the kitchen, taking in the fallen broom, the overturned cane, the way his mother's usually immaculate appearance was disheveled and bloodied. His gaze finally landed on Monica, who stood frozen by the kitchen island with her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "What kind of accident?" he asked, and something in his tone made Monica's stomach clench with dread. "She was trying to reach something in the upper cabinet," Monica said quickly, the lie spilling from her lips with desperate fluency. "I told her to wait for me to help, but you know how independent she is. She must have lost her balance and fallen." Stephen's eyes narrowed as he looked from his mother's injuries to the broom on the floor, then back to Monica's too bright expression. She fell. Yes, Monica said firmly. I found her like this when I came into the kitchen. I was just about to help her up when you arrived. But Stephen was studying the scene with the analytical mind that had made him a business success. The broom lay several feet away from where his mother had fallen. The cane was by the doorway, as if it had been dropped rather than fallen with her. And his mother's injuries, those red marks on her arms, didn't look like the kind of damage someone would sustain from a simple fall. Mom, Stephen said gently, his hands helping her sit up against the kitchen island. Can you tell me exactly what happened? Margaret's face was a study in conflicted emotions. Her loyalty to her son warred with her natural honesty, while her fear of Monica battled against her desire to protect Stephen from a truth that would devastate him. Margaret began, then stopped. Her unseeing eyes seemed to search the air, as if looking for guidance. I was reaching for something, and I lost my balance. Stephen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He knew his mother's voice better than anyone, and he could hear the careful control in her words, the way she was choosing each syllable with unusual precision. What were you reaching for? He asked. The question hung in the air like smoke. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed again. Monica held her breath, realizing too late that they hadn't coordinated their story beyond the basic lie. The tea canister, Margaret said finally. On the high shelf. Stephen's eyes moved to the tea cabinet, which was closed and showed no signs of having been disturbed. The canister Margaret supposedly wanted was clearly visible on the counter, exactly where Mrs. Henderson always left it after preparing the day's service. The tea canister, Stephen repeated slowly, his voice taking on a dangerous edge that Monica had never heard before. The one that's sitting right here on the counter? Margaret's face crumpled slightly as she realized her mistake. The lie that had seemed like the path of least resistance was falling apart under her son's careful questioning. Monica jumped in quickly, her voice bright with false concern. You know how disoriented she gets sometimes, Stephen. After a fall like that, it's natural for her to be confused about the details. The words were meant to be helpful, but they had the opposite effect. Stephen's head turned toward Monica with a look that could have frozen fire, and Margaret made a small sound of distress at the suggestion that her blindness made her mentally incompetent. My mother, Stephen said with icy precision, is not confused. She's one of the sharpest people I know, and her memory is flawless. Monica's cheeks flushed with embarrassment and growing panic. I didn't mean. I just thought. You thought what exactly? Stephen rose to his feet slowly, his full height and presence suddenly seeming to fill the kitchen. You thought that because she can't see, she can't think clearly. Stephen, please, Margaret said from the floor, her voice weak. Don't fight. I just want to go to my room and rest. But Stephen was studying Monica's face now with the intensity he usually reserved for corporate negotiations where millions of dollars hung in the balance. He was seeing things he'd never noticed before, or perhaps had chosen not to notice. The way Monica's eyes wouldn't quite meet his, the defensive set of her shoulders, the tremor in her hands that she was trying to hide. How long have you been home? He asked suddenly. Monica blinked, caught off guard by the question. What? From wherever you went today. How long have you been back in the house? I never left. I've been here all day. Stephen nodded slowly, as if filing away that information. So you were here when this accident happened? Yes, but I was upstairs. I heard the crash and came running. You heard the crash? Stephen repeated. From upstairs. Monica nodded eagerly, relieved that he seemed to be accepting her explanation. Yes, it was so loud I thought someone had broken in. But Stephen's expression didn't soften. If anything, it grew more concerned. Mom, when you fell, did you call out? Did you make any noise that would have alerted Monica? Margaret's silence stretched long enough to become damning. Monica watched in growing horror as Stephen's face went through a series of micro-expressions, confusion, suspicion, and finally a terrible understanding. She was probably too shocked to cry out, Monica said desperately. You know how these things happen so fast. Stop. Stephen's voice cut through her explanation like a blade. Just stop talking for a minute. He knelt beside his mother again, his voice gentling as he spoke to her. Mom, I need you to be completely honest with me. Are you afraid of something? Margaret's hands were shaking now, and tears had begun to leak from her sightless eyes. Stephen, I just want this to be over. What to be over? His voice was patient but implacable. Mom, if someone hurt you, I need to know. The kitchen fell silent except for the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and Margaret's unsteady breathing. Monica felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, watching the ground crumble beneath her feet. Nobody hurt me, Margaret whispered finally. I fell. But even as she said the words, fresh tears rolled down her cheeks, and Stephen could see the way her whole body seemed to shrink in on itself, as if she were trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. Stephen stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled in the way that meant he was holding back a volcano of emotion. When he spoke, his voice was quietly devastating. Monica, I want you to go upstairs and pack a bag. Monica's world tilted on its axis. What? Stephen, what are you saying? I'm saying that I want you out of this house. Tonight. But I told you what happened. Your mother fell, and I. My mother, Stephen interrupted, his voice rising for the first time, has marks on her arms that look like she was hit with something. There's a broom on the floor that shouldn't be there. And she's more afraid right now than I've ever seen her in my entire life. Monica felt hysteria clawing at her throat. You're choosing her over me? Without even hearing my side of the story. Stephen's laugh was harsh and bitter. Your side of the story? You mean the one where my blind, 72-year-old mother somehow managed to beat herself up while trying to reach a tea canister that was never moved from the counter? Stephen, please. Monica's voice broke on his name. I love you. We're supposed to get married. Don't throw away everything we have because of a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. Stephen shook his head in disbelief. Is that what you're calling this? Margaret struggled to her feet, using the kitchen island for support. Her voice was stronger now, as if Stephen's presence had given her back some measure of courage. Stephen, she said quietly, I think Monica should stay. We can work this out. Both Stephen and Monica turned to stare at her in shock. Margaret's offer of reconciliation seemed to come from nowhere, especially given what had just transpired between the two women. Mom, you don't have to, Stephen began. No, Margaret interrupted, her voice gaining strength. I think we should all sit down and talk about this like adults. Monica is going to be part of this family, and families work through their problems. Stephen's face was a battlefield of conflicting emotions. His protective instincts screamed at him to get Monica away from his vulnerable mother, but Margaret's apparent willingness to forgive was confusing him, making him question his own perceptions. Monica seized on Margaret's unexpected lifeline like a drowning woman grasping for shore. Yes, she said eagerly. Let's talk about this. I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. But as Stephen looked between the two women, his injured mother and his fiancée, who couldn't quite meet his eyes, he realized that the only misunderstanding had been his own. He'd been blind to something that had been building in his house for months, maybe years. The question that terrified him most was how long this had been going on, and what else he might have missed while he was traveling the world and building his empire. What would you do if you discovered that someone you trusted completely had been hurting a person you love? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between believing what you saw and what you were told? The silence in the kitchen stretched taut as a violin string, threatening to snap at any moment. Stephen stood between the two women who meant everything to him, feeling like he was balancing on a razor's edge where one wrong move would send his entire world crashing down around him. All right, he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. Let's sit down and talk about this. But even as he spoke the words, Stephen's mind was racing with details that didn't add up. His mother's injuries, the positioning of the broom, the way Monica's story kept shifting slightly with each telling. And most damning of all, the fear he could see in his mother's sightless eyes. A fear that spoke of more than just a simple fall. Monica moved quickly to help Margaret to one of the kitchen chairs, her movements solicitous and caring. To anyone watching, she would have appeared to be the perfect devoted daughter-in-law, tenderly assisting an injured elder. But Stephen noticed the way his mother flinched when Monica's hands touched her shoulders. It was subtle, so brief that he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching carefully, but it was there. Margaret Jensen, who had never shown fear of anything in her entire life, was afraid of the woman he'd planned to marry. "There," Monica said softly, settling Margaret into the chair with exaggerated gentleness. "Is that comfortable? Can I get you some ice for your lip?" Margaret's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. "No, thank you. I'm fine." Stephen pulled out chairs for himself and Monica, but remained standing. Something inside him couldn't settle, couldn't accept the tableau of domestic tranquility they were trying to present. "Mom," he said gently, "I want you to tell me exactly what happened today. From the beginning." Margaret's breath hitched slightly. "Stephen, I already told you." "No," he interrupted, his voice firmer now. "You told me you fell while reaching for tea. But I want to know about your whole day. What time did you wake up? What did you have for breakfast? What were you doing before the accident happened?" Monica shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Stephen, why does any of that matter? Your mother is hurt, and you're interrogating her like she's a suspect in some crime." Stephen's eyes snapped to Monica's face, and she took an involuntary step back at the intensity she saw there. "I'm trying to understand how my healthy, careful mother, who has navigated this house safely for 5 years, suddenly became so careless that she nearly killed herself trying to reach something that was already within easy reach." "Accidents happen," Monica said defensively, "even to careful people." "Do they?" Stephen moved to the kitchen counter and picked up the tea canister his mother had supposedly been reaching for. "This weighs maybe 2 pounds. Mrs. Henderson always leaves it in the exact same spot every day, right here where Mom can easily reach it. Why would she need to climb on anything to get it?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "I was confused." "You're never confused." Stephen's voice was gentle but relentless. "Mom, your spatial memory is better than most sighted people's. You could navigate this kitchen blindfolded, which you essentially do every day." Monica stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the tile floor. "This is ridiculous. You're treating me like I'm some kind of criminal, when all I did was try to help your mother after she fell." "Then help me understand the timeline," Stephen said, his businessman's instincts taking over. "You said you were upstairs when you heard the crash. What were you doing up there?" I was choosing what to wear for dinner. I wanted to look nice for when you came home." "What time was this?" Monica's eyes darted away from his. "I don't know exactly. Maybe 3 o'clock. Stephen glanced at the kitchen clock, which showed 4:30 p.m. "And you've been dealing with Mom's injuries for an hour and a half without calling a doctor, or even cleaning the blood off her face." The question hit Monica like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on crafting her story that she'd forgotten to consider the practical implications of her timeline. She said she didn't want to make a fuss. She insisted she was fine. But Stephen was already moving, pulling his phone from his pocket. "I'm calling Dr. Williams. Mom needs to be examined properly." "No." Margaret's voice cut through the kitchen with startling force. "No doctors, Stephen. Please." Stephen froze, his thumb hovering over his contacts list. "Mom, you could have a concussion. Those marks on your arms need to be looked at." "They're just bruises," Margaret said quickly. "I bruise easily now that I'm older. It looks worse than it is." Stephen knelt beside his mother's chair, taking her hands in his. Her fingers were ice cold and trembling. Mom, talk to me. What's really going on here? For a moment, Margaret seemed to waver on the edge of confession. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but then her gaze moved in Monica's direction, and whatever courage she'd been gathering seemed to desert her. Nothing's going on, she whispered. I fell. That's all. But Stephen had spent 35 years reading his mother's moods and expressions. He knew when she was lying, and he knew when she was afraid. Right now she was both. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who had built an empire through his ability to see through deception and get to the truth. Monica, I want you to go upstairs and pack your things. Stephen. Now. Monica's face crumpled with desperation. Please don't do this. I love you. We're supposed to get married in 3 months. Don't throw away everything we have because of one misunderstanding. This isn't a misunderstanding, Stephen said quietly. This is me finally seeing something I should have noticed a long time ago. Monica's composure finally cracked completely. She's been trying to turn you against me since the day we met, she screamed, pointing an accusing finger at Margaret. She hates me. She's never wanted us to be together. So you decided to beat her with a broom? The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Monica's face went white as she realized what she'd just confirmed, and Margaret made a small sound of distress. I didn't. Monica started, then stopped. The cat was out of the bag now, and there was no putting it back. You don't understand what it's been like. 2 years of her passive-aggressive comments, her subtle undermining, her constant attempts to make me feel like I don't belong. Stephen's voice was deadly quiet. So you beat my blind, 72-year-old mother with a cleaning implement. She pushed me to it. Monica's voice was shrill now, all pretense of control gone. She told me you were going to make me sign a prenup. She suggested I should leave and think about what I really want. She's been trying to drive me away since day one. Margaret's face had gone very pale, but she spoke with quiet dignity. I may have had concerns about your relationship, Monica, but I never tried to drive you away. I wanted to understand your feelings for my son. Your feelings? Monica laughed hysterically. You wanted to prove I was a gold digger. You wanted to show Stephen that I wasn't good enough for your precious family. Stephen felt something cold and terrible settling in his chest as he listened to Monica's words. Not because of what she was saying about his mother, but because of what she was revealing about herself. My mother's opinions about our relationship, he said slowly, gave you the right to assault her? I didn't assault her. Monica protested, even as the words rang hollow in the face of Margaret's visible injuries. I lost my temper. She kept pushing and pushing until I snapped. You beat her with a broom, Stephen repeated, his voice growing harder with each word. You attacked a blind, elderly woman because you didn't like what she said to you. Monica seemed to realize that her explanations were only making things worse. She switched tactics, moving towards Stephen with tears streaming down her face. Stephen, please, she whispered, reaching for his hands. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I love you so much, and the thought of losing you just made me crazy. Stephen pulled his hands away from her touch, as if she'd burned him. You think love justifies what you did? I think love makes people do things they never thought they were capable of, Monica said desperately. You've never been in a position where someone was threatening everything you cared about. You don't know what that kind of fear can do to a person. You're right, Stephen said quietly. I don't know, but I'm learning. He moved to the kitchen window, staring out at the perfectly manicured grounds of his estate. Everything looked exactly as it had when he'd left for Singapore a week ago, but somehow the entire world had shifted on its axis. How long? He asked without turning around. How long what? Monica's voice was small and frightened. How long have you been abusing my mother? The question hit the kitchen like a thunderclap. Monica gasped as if she'd been slapped, while Margaret made a sound that was half sob, half sigh. I never abused her, Monica protested, This was the first time anything like this ever happened. But Stephen was thinking now with the cold precision that had made him a business success. He was remembering all the times he'd come home to find his mother unusually quiet. The way she'd started declining invitations to join him and Monica for dinner or outings. The gradual withdrawal that he'd attributed to her natural adjustment to his having someone new in his life. "Mom," he said, still facing the window, "tell me the truth. Has Monica ever hurt you before?" The silence stretched so long that Stephen began to think his mother wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Not physically. Stephen closed his eyes, feeling like someone had punched him in the stomach. "What do you mean, not physically?" Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. She said things. Little comments that made me feel unwelcome in my own home. Questions about why I needed to live here instead of in a nice assisted living facility. Suggestions that I was holding you back from living your own life. Stephen turned around slowly, his face a mask of controlled fury. Monica's face was streaked with tears, her carefully applied makeup running in dark rivulets down her cheeks. "Stephen, you have to understand. I felt like she was trying to control our relationship. I felt like she was always there, always watching, always judging everything I did. So you decided to make her feel unwelcome in the house I bought specifically, so she could live with me safely. I didn't mean for it to come out that way," Monica sobbed. "I just wanted some space for us to be a couple without feeling like we were being monitored all the time." Stephen looked at this woman he'd thought he loved, this woman he'd planned to marry and build a life with, and felt like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. The beauty was still there, the charm that had first attracted him, but underneath it was something ugly and cruel that he'd been blind to. "You wanted space," he repeated slowly. "So you systematically bullied my disabled mother until she was afraid to be comfortable in her own home. It wasn't like that. And when that wasn't enough, when she still wouldn't disappear quietly, you escalated to physical violence." Monica's sobs were getting louder, more desperate. "Stephen, please, I can change. I know I made a mistake, but I can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can work through this together." Stephen moved to his mother's chair and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Margaret leaned into his touch with obvious relief, and he could feel some of the tension leave her body at his presence. "The only mistake," he said quietly, "was mine. I brought someone into this house who hurt the person I love most in the world, and I was too blind to see it happening." Monica fell to her knees beside Stephen's chair, clutching at his legs with desperate hands. "Don't say that. Don't throw away 2 years of love because of one terrible day. I'll apologize to your mother. I'll make it up to her. I'll do whatever it takes." Stephen looked down at her with something that might have been pity. "Monica, you beat my blind mother with a broom. You hurt someone who couldn't defend herself because you didn't like what she said to you. There's no coming back from that. But I love you," Monica screamed, her voice echoing off the kitchen walls. "I love you more than anyone ever has or ever will. Doesn't that mean anything?" Stephen gently disentangled himself from her grasping hands and stood up. "If this is what your love looks like," he said quietly, "then I don't want it." The words hit Monica like physical blows. She collapsed completely, curling in on herself on the kitchen floor as sobs racked her body. "Please," she whispered through her tears. "Please don't do this. I'll leave your mother alone. I'll never say another word to her. I'll move out if you want. But please don't end us. Please." Stephen knelt beside his mother's chair, taking her hands in his. "Mom, I'm going to call Dr. Williams to come check you out. And then I'm going to make sure Monica leaves this house and never comes back." Margaret squeezed his hands tightly. "Stephen, are you sure? I don't want to be the reason you lose someone you love." Stephen's throat tightened with emotion. "Mom, you could never be the reason I lose anything. You're the reason I have everything. And anyone who would hurt you, they were never worthy of my love in the first place." Monica's sobs reached a crescendo at his words, but Stephen felt no sympathy for her tears. She'd had countless opportunities to treat his mother with kindness and respect. She'd had 2 years to prove that she could be a worthy addition to their family. Instead, she'd chosen cruelty and violence. As he pulled out his phone to call the doctor, Stephen realized that the woman crying on his kitchen floor had never really loved him at all. She'd loved his money, his status, the lifestyle he could provide. But love, real love, didn't hurt innocent people. Real love didn't demand that he choose between his fiancée and his mother. Real love would have embraced Margaret as family instead of seeing her as an obstacle to be eliminated. And that was a lesson Monica Brown was about to learn far too late. Have you ever had to make a choice between loyalty to family and loyalty to a romantic partner? What do you think is the difference between love and possession? Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who can hurt us the deepest. How do we protect ourselves and our loved ones without becoming suspicious of everyone? Share your thoughts on where the line should be drawn when it comes to defending the people we love. Dr. Williams arrived within the hour, his medical bag in hand, and his expression grave, as Stephen explained the situation in carefully measured tones. The family physician had been caring for the Jensen family for over 2 decades, and he'd never seen Stephen look as strained as he did standing in that kitchen doorway. "Let's have a look at you, Margaret," Dr. Williams said gently, his practiced hands examining the bruises on her arms and the split lip that had finally stopped bleeding. "Can you tell me where it hurts?" Margaret submitted to the examination with quiet dignity, though Stephen noticed how she winced when the doctor touched her ribs. Each small sound of pain felt like a knife twisting in his chest, a reminder of how completely he'd failed to protect the most important person in his life. "Well," Dr. Williams said finally, snapping his medical bag shut, "you're going to be sore for a few days, but nothing appears to be broken. The bruising will get worse before it gets better, I'm afraid, but that's normal. I want you to take it easy for the next week. No lifting anything heavy, no sudden movements." He turned to Stephen with a concerned expression. "Son, these injuries, they're consistent with what you told me, but I have to ask, are we going to have any more incidents like this?" Stephen's jaw tightened. "No, sir. The person responsible is leaving tonight, and she won't be coming back." From the living room came the sound of Monica packing, her movements punctuated by occasional sobs that neither Stephen nor Margaret acknowledged. The engagement ring, a 5-carat diamond that had cost Stephen more than most people's houses, sat abandoned on the kitchen counter, where Monica had left it after Stephen made it clear that their relationship was over. Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. "Good. Margaret, if you experience any dizziness, severe headaches, or if the pain gets worse instead of better, you call me immediately. And Stephen," he fixed the younger man with a stern look, "make sure she actually rests. You know how stubborn she can be." After the doctor left, Stephen found himself alone with his mother for the first time since discovering the assault. Margaret sat in her favorite chair by the window, her hands folded carefully in her lap, looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen her. "Mom," Stephen said softly, pulling a chair close to hers. "I'm so sorry." Margaret turned her face toward his voice, confusion evident in her expression. "Sorry? Darling, you have nothing to apologize for." "I brought her into our home," Stephen said, his voice thick with guilt. "I loved someone who hurt you, and I was too blind to see what was happening right in front of me." Margaret reached out, her fingers finding his face with the unerring accuracy of long practice. "Stephen, you couldn't have known. Monica hid this side of herself very well. But you tried to tell me, didn't you?" Stephen caught her hand in his, pressing it against his cheek. "All those little comments I dismissed as motherly concern. You were trying to warn me." Margaret's smile was sad but gentle. "I had my suspicions, yes. But I hoped I was wrong. I wanted you to be happy, even if it meant accepting someone I wasn't sure about." Stephen thought about all the signs he'd missed. His mother's gradual withdrawal from family activities, The way she'd stopped joining them for dinner, her increasing reluctance to spend time in the common areas of the house when Monica was around. He'd attributed it all to natural adjustment, to his mother learning to share his attention with someone new. "Why didn't you tell me directly?" he asked. "Why didn't you just say that Monica was treating you badly?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her thumb stroking across his knuckles in the same comforting gesture she'd used when he was a child with skinned knees and hurt feelings. "Because I was afraid you'd choose her over me," she admitted finally. "And I was afraid that if I forced you to make that choice, I'd lose you forever." Stephen's heart broke at the quiet acceptance in her voice, the resignation of a woman who had convinced herself that her son's happiness mattered more than her own safety and dignity. "Mom," he said fiercely, "you will never lose me. Ever. There is no woman on earth worth more to me than you are. You gave up everything to raise me after Dad died. You worked 2 jobs to put me through college. You believed in me when no one else would. I would never, ever choose someone else over you." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time in hours, they seemed to be tears of relief rather than pain. "I know that now," she whispered. "But when you love someone the way you loved Monica, sometimes fear clouds your judgment." From upstairs came the sound of suitcases being dragged across the floor, followed by Monica's footsteps on the stairs. Stephen tensed, prepared to physically block her if she tried to approach his mother again, but Monica appeared in the doorway with her bags and kept her distance. "Stephen," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "I'm ready to go." Stephen stood slowly, his body language making it clear that he was placing himself between Monica and his mother. "Good." Monica's face was blotchy and swollen from tears, her usually perfect appearance disheveled and broken. She looked like a woman who had lost everything that mattered to her in the span of a few hours. "I know you don't want to hear this," she said quietly, "but I really did love you. I still love you." Stephen's expression didn't soften. "No, Monica. You loved what I could give you. You loved the lifestyle, the security, the status. But you never loved me enough to respect the person who means the most to me." Monica's shoulders sagged in defeat. What if I got help? Therapy, anger management, whatever it takes. Could you ever forgive me? For hurting my mother? Stephen's voice was ice cold. "Never." Monica nodded as if she'd expected that answer, but the finality of it still seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She hefted her bags and turned toward the door, then paused. "Margaret," she said softly, not turning around. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I'm sorry." Margaret's voice was steady when she replied. "I hope you find the help you need, Monica. Not for our sake, but for your own." After Monica left, the house seemed to exhale in relief. Stephen found himself moving through the rooms, unconsciously checking locks and security cameras, his protective instincts on high alert even though the threat was gone. When he returned to the living room, he found Margaret still sitting by the window, but there was something different about her posture. The tension that had seemed to permeate her very bones was finally beginning to ease. "How do you feel?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. Margaret considered the question seriously. "Sore," she said finally, "and tired, but also lighter somehow, like I can breathe again." Stephen understood that feeling perfectly. It was as if a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted from his shoulders. The next few days fell into a new rhythm. Stephen cancelled all his business trips and worked from home, claiming he needed to supervise his mother's recovery, but really just needing to assure himself that she was safe and healing. They had Mrs. Henderson prepare all of Margaret's favorite meals, and Stephen found himself reading to his mother in the evenings, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager. "You know," Margaret said one evening as they sat in the garden room watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, "I think this might have been a blessing in disguise." Stephen looked up from the business journal he'd been reading aloud. "How do you figure that?" "If Monica had been better at hiding her true nature, You might have married her. You might have spent years slowly realizing that you'd chosen someone who couldn't love the people you love. Margaret's voice was thoughtful, reflective. Sometimes the worst thing that can happen to us reveals truths we needed to see. Stephen considered this as he watched the last light of day fade from the sky. I thought I loved her, he said quietly. But looking back now, I think I was in love with the idea of her. The perfect woman who would complete my perfect life. And what do you think the real thing will look like? Margaret asked gently. Stephen smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in days. I think she'll be someone who lights up when she meets you instead of seeing you as competition. Someone who wants to hear your stories about Dad instead of changing the subject every time you mention him. Someone who makes our family bigger instead of trying to make it smaller. Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand. She's out there, darling. And when you find her, you'll know the difference immediately. 3 months later, Stephen met that woman. Her name was Jessica Martinez, and she was the new director of the children's literacy program that the Jensen Foundation had been funding for years. She'd come to the house for a routine meeting about the foundation's upcoming grants, but what was supposed to be a 1-hour business discussion turned into a 3-hour conversation that ranged from education policy to shared memories of growing up with single mothers. What struck Stephen most was the way Jessica interacted with Margaret. When his mother mentioned that she'd been a teacher before her marriage, Jessica's face lit up with genuine interest. What grade did you teach? Jessica asked, settling into the chair next to Margaret's as if she belonged there. 2nd grade, Margaret replied, her voice warming with pleasure at finding someone who shared her passion for education. 37 years of 7-year-olds who thought they knew everything about the world. Jessica laughed, a rich, genuine sound that filled the room with warmth. My mother taught 3rd grade. She always said that 2nd grade teachers were the real heroes, because you got the kids right after they learned to read, but before they learned to be cynical. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Stephen had witnessed during Monica's 2-year presence in their home. Jessica asked thoughtful questions about Margaret's teaching methods, shared stories about her own education, and genuinely listened to the older woman's responses. There was no polite tolerance, no subtle attempts to change the subject, just real interest and connection. When Jessica's phone rang with an emergency at the literacy center, she apologized profusely for having to cut their visit short. I hope I can come back soon, she said to Margaret, taking the older woman's hands in hers. I'd love to hear more about your teaching stories. I bet you have some wonderful ones. Margaret's smile was radiant. I'd enjoy that very much, dear. After Jessica left, Margaret turned to Stephen with a knowing expression. Well, she said simply. That was different. Stephen found himself grinning like a teenager. Yes, it was. She's lovely, Stephen. Really lovely. I know, Stephen said, already planning when he could see Jessica again. And Mom, she sees you. She really sees you, not just as an obstacle to navigate around. Margaret's eyes filled with happy tears. I noticed that too. 6 months later, Stephen proposed to Jessica in the garden room where she'd first sat with his mother, sharing stories and building the foundation of what would become a beautiful friendship. Jessica said yes through tears of joy, and her first words after accepting were, "Can we call your mom? I want to tell her together." Margaret cried when they shared the news, but these were tears of pure happiness. For the first time in years, she felt like she was gaining a daughter instead of losing a son. The wedding was small and intimate, held in the garden of the Jensen estate with Margaret serving as Stephen's best man, and Jessica's young niece as the flower girl. During the ceremony, Jessica's vows included a promise to honor and cherish not just Stephen, but the woman who had raised him to be the man she fell in love with. At the reception, Stephen watched his new wife dancing with his mother, both women laughing at some shared joke, and felt a peace he'd never experienced before. This was what love was supposed to look like. Not a zero-sum game where someone had to lose, but an expansion of family that made everyone richer. Later that evening, as the last guests departed and Jessica helped Margaret to her room with the easy familiarity of someone who genuinely cared, Stephen reflected on how differently his life might have turned out if Monica had succeeded in driving his mother away. He thought about the woman who had tried to isolate him from his family, who had used violence against someone who couldn't defend herself, who had seen love as possession rather than partnership. Monica had disappeared from their lives completely after that terrible day, and Stephen had never tried to find out what became of her. Some chapters, he'd learned, were meant to be closed forever. But the chapter he was beginning now, with a wife who treasured his mother almost as much as he did, with a family that was growing stronger instead of fragmenting, that was a story he was eager to write. As he locked up the house that night, Stephen paused in the hallway where Monica's portrait had once hung alongside his. The wall was bare now, waiting for new memories to fill the space. Soon, he thought, there would be pictures of Jessica and Margaret gardening together, of family holidays that included everyone, of the children he and Jessica hoped to have someday. Children who would grow up knowing they were part of a family that protected and cherished each other. The house that had once felt like a battlefield now felt like a sanctuary again. And in the master bedroom, Stephen fell asleep next to his wife, knowing that the woman downstairs was safe, loved, and finally free from fear. Love, Stephen had learned, wasn't about choosing sides. Real love made room for everyone who mattered, and anyone who demanded that you choose between them and your family wasn't offering love at all. They were offering a prison, beautifully decorated, but a prison nonetheless. And Stephen Jensen would never be imprisoned again.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.